June 7, 1944, near St. Lo, Normandy. The damp scent of churned soil and cordite clung to the air as dawn crept across the hedgerows. Mist hovered low, clinging to the earth like a ghost that refused to leave the battlefield. Sergeant Klaus Weber of the 2nd Panzer Division crouched beside his Panzer IV, binoculars pressed against his eyes, scanning the distant fields where the Americans were rumored to be advancing. To his right, Feldwebel Otto Kraus lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the ember flickering against the pale blue of early morning. "They say the Yankees brought thousands of Shermans," he muttered, voice muffled by the wind. "But they burn easy." Klaus smirked. That had been the rumor since Africa, the so-called Tommy Cooker. The Americans' M4 Sherman was fast, yes, but thin-skinned and volatile. A single hit from the Panzer's 75mm gun usually turned it into a blazing coffin. Klaus had seen it happen too many times to count. And yet, something about this morning felt different. In the distance, a low rumble grew, steady, rhythmic, unnatural. It wasn't the chaotic thunder of artillery, nor the soft growl of a few tanks maneuvering. This was something else. The ground itself began to tremble under their boots. "Engines," Otto whispered, his cigarette dropping into the mud. "A lot of them." Through the fog, black silhouettes emerged, one after another, gliding between the hedgerows. Shermans, but not the usual kind. Klaus frowned, adjusting the focus. The outlines were strange, bulkier, their turrets sitting lower, and their gun barrels longer than before. They moved in disciplined formation, covered by infantry that flowed around them like water. Even more unsettling, the tanks didn't roar forward blindly as before. They advanced deliberately, coordinated, almost as if they could see beyond the hedgerows. Klaus barked to his loader. "Prepare armor-piercing rounds. Range 800 meters." The Panzer's turret rotated with a metallic groan, and through the gun sight, Klaus tracked one of the American tanks breaking cover. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger. A sharp metallic clang echoed as the shell struck the Sherman's front armor and ricocheted harmlessly away. Klaus blinked in disbelief. "Hit confirmed. No penetration." Before he could fire again, the Sherman turned. Fast. Far faster than expected. The new gun swiveled, almost instantly locking onto their position. "Down!" Otto yelled. The Sherman's cannon fired. The sound tore through the countryside like thunder. The impact hit the Panzer's upper glacis, and the explosion ripped through the crew compartment. When the smoke cleared, Klaus was on the ground, ears ringing, half covered in dirt and debris. His tank was gone, flames licking at what was once a proud machine, and through the haze, he saw it, the Sherman that had fired the shot. On its turret, the marking was unmistakable. 76mm M1A1. A newer gun, longer, deadlier, capable of killing a Panzer IV at ranges the Germans once believed safe. Klaus whispered to himself, "That's impossible." As more Shermans emerged from the fog, moving like a mechanical tide, the realization sank in. The Americans had changed the game. The Tommy Cooker was gone. This was something new, something the Germans had never seen coming. Hours later, as the smoke cleared over the Bocage countryside, the shattered remnants of Klaus Weber's platoon regrouped behind the ruins of an old stone farmhouse. The air was thick with the acrid stench of fuel and scorched paint. The battlefield still trembled from distant tank engines, Shermans, sweeping through like wolves that had learned new tricks. Klaus leaned against a cracked wall, blood trickling from a cut across his brow. His radio operator, barely 20, was frantically adjusting dials on the field set. Static hissed, punctuated by clipped, desperate German voices. Reports were pouring in from every direction. Panzergruppe 3, destroyed near Pont-Hébert. Tiger immobilized. Repeat, Tiger immobilized. Shermans with long guns, engaging from range. Armor not holding. The last words made Klaus freeze. Long guns. He wasn't the only one who'd seen it. Whatever those Americans had brought to Normandy, it wasn't the same old M4. By noon, captured intelligence began filtering back to higher command. Through the fog of war, the picture grew clearer and far more disturbing. The Allies had quietly upgraded their workhorse tank months before the invasion. What the Germans were now facing were not standard M4s, but M4A1 76Ws and M4A3 76Ws, Shermans armed with the high-velocity 76 Semele M1A1 gun. Lighter than the Panther or Tiger, yes, but now with teeth sharp enough to bite back.
For years, German crews had mocked the Sherman as a death trap, easy prey for their 75mm and 88mm guns. But what they never realized was that the Americans had been listening, learning, adapting. Back in late 1943, across the Atlantic, American ordnance engineers and field commanders had been pushing hard for change.
Reports from Tunisia and Italy told the same grim story. Shermans couldn't reliably penetrate German armor, especially the dreaded Tiger and Panther. General Omar Bradley, frustrated by mounting losses, had demanded an answer. That answer was the M1A1 high-velocity gun, a weapon capable of firing armor-piercing rounds at 2,600 feet per second. When loaded with the new M62 APC round, it could penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at over 1,000 yards, something unthinkable just a year earlier. But firepower wasn't the only secret advantage. What really stunned the Germans that summer in Normandy wasn't the gun. It was how the Americans used the Sherman. Hidden inside those tanks was something few on the German side could comprehend. An invisible edge that changed the nature of tank warfare entirely: communication. Every Sherman, even the command tanks, came equipped with reliable two-way radios. In contrast, many German tanks, especially older models, were still using hand signals, flares, or shouted commands in the chaos of battle. That meant while Klaus's panzer crew was waiting for orders or trying to guess the enemy's next move, the Shermans were already coordinating flanking maneuvers, calling in artillery, or adjusting their formation in real time. A group of Shermans didn't move like a herd. They moved like a pack, guided by one mind. That was the Americans' hidden advantage. As the afternoon sun bled through the drifting smoke, Klaus could see it for himself. Across the valley, a line of Shermans advanced, not recklessly, but rhythmically, covering each other's movements with machine-like precision. He could almost hear their radios buzzing with clipped, confident voices. "Blue 2, shift right. Enemy gun at 11 o'clock. Copy that, Blue 1. Smoke out, advancing." They weren't just faster. They were connected. And in that connection lay a power the Germans had fatally underestimated. Klaus turned to Otto, who was staring silently at the wrecks of their division's tanks burning across the hedgerows. "They fight like they already know where we are," Otto said quietly. Klaus nodded grimly. "Maybe they do." Somewhere beyond those hedgerows, in a command jeep packed with radios, a young American lieutenant was watching the same battlefield unfold, calling precise coordinates, feeding his tankers real-time intelligence from spotter planes overhead. For the Germans, the battlefield was a fog of uncertainty. For the Americans, it was a chessboard, and the Shermans were moving exactly as planned. By dusk, the battlefield outside St. Lo looked like the surface of another planet, cratered, scorched, and scattered with the twisted carcasses of machines that had once ruled Europe. The mighty panzer divisions, once symbols of German invincibility, now found themselves fighting blind against a relentless enemy that seemed to anticipate every move. Klaus Weber sat with what remained of his crew in a shallow ditch beside the smoking remains of their Panzer IV. His head throbbed, and his throat was raw from shouting over the gunfire. Otto crouched nearby, clutching a pair of field binoculars scavenged from the wreck, peering across the ridge. Through the drifting smoke, they saw them again, the Shermans still advancing. But this time, Klaus noticed something different. Their movement wasn't random. Every tank operated in sync with the infantry beside them. Engineers followed close behind, clearing mines and cutting paths through hedgerows. Machine gunners covered the flanks, while mortars fired bursts of smoke precisely where the Shermans needed concealment. It wasn't brute force that broke the German lines. It was coordination. "Look at them," Otto muttered. "They fight like ants, hundreds of them, each knowing exactly what to do." Klaus frowned. "No, not ants. Ants don't communicate. These do." He didn't yet understand the full picture, but what he was witnessing was the culmination of something that had begun months earlier, something the Germans had failed to see coming. Across the Channel, before D-Day ever began, the US Army had built its war machine on an idea that seemed deceptively simple. Logistics and adaptability win wars. For every Sherman that rolled off the line, there were mechanics, supply officers, and engineers ensuring that tank would never fight alone. American industry had made it possible not just to produce tanks faster, but to upgrade them faster too. Where the Germans were building technical marvels like the Tiger and Panther, machines of terrifying power but immense complexity, the Americans focused on something more practical, a tank that could be repaired in the field, supported in battle, and most crucially, replaced in days, not weeks. That philosophy extended into every bolt of the Sherman's design. When the Allies landed in Normandy, the US Army didn't just bring tanks. They brought an entire ecosystem: recovery vehicles, fuel trucks, mobile workshops, and communications units that turned chaos into efficiency. It was this infrastructure that gave the Sherman its hidden advantage. If one was knocked out, another was already en route. If a transmission failed, a new one could be fitted before sunrise. If an engine caught fire, mechanics had spare parts on hand before the smoke even cleared. To the Germans, who spent weeks repairing a single Tiger, this seemed impossible. But to the Americans, it was simply Tuesday. Even more critical was how fast the Americans could adapt tactically. After reports from the Normandy hedgerows described how difficult it was to maneuver tanks in the dense terrain, US units didn't wait for orders from above. They improvised. Engineers welded on makeshift metal prongs, turning Shermans into rhinos, capable of ripping through thick hedgerows like battering rams. Infantry learned to move with tanks in tight coordination, calling in artillery and airstrikes within minutes. What German officers dismissed as chaotic American fighting was, in truth, flexible warfare. By the time Klaus's unit received new orders, it was already too late. The Americans had broken through the first defensive line and were pushing toward St. Lo. The once formidable German network of defenses, built on the assumption of predictable enemy tactics, was collapsing under the pressure of something faster, smarter, and more dynamic than they'd prepared for. Klaus watched as a column of Shermans halted near a cluster of barns in the distance. Within seconds, infantry swarmed forward, securing the area. One Sherman, its commander standing tall from the hatch, waved his arm, signaling the others. Then something uncanny happened. A formation of P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead, releasing their payloads on German artillery positions hidden in the tree line. The timing was flawless, almost too flawless. "Air cover on demand," Otto said bitterly. "How do they coordinate so fast?" Klaus didn't answer. He knew the truth now. It wasn't luck. Those Shermans weren't fighting alone. Every tank was a node in a vast network of communication, linking infantry, armor, and aircraft in one lethal symphony. He turned his gaze toward the burning horizon, where more Shermans rolled in, each one identical, efficient, unstoppable. "Their strength," Klaus whispered, "isn't in one tank. It's in all of them together." As night fell over Normandy, the myth of German armor supremacy began to die, silently, under the treads of a machine the Germans had underestimated for too long. July 10th, 1944. Near St. Lo, the bocage had turned into a maze of mud, smoke, and shattered trees. The once serene countryside was now a labyrinth of ambushes and death traps, perfect for the Germans' defensive tactics, or so they believed. Klaus Weber wiped grime from his face and crouched in a shallow ditch beside a new Panther tank his unit had received just days earlier. Its 75mm high-velocity gun was a masterpiece of engineering, capable of killing a Sherman at 2 kilometers. In theory, the battlefield should have belonged to him. But reality didn't match the manuals anymore. Every time they tried to set up a defensive position, the Shermans seemed to know, appearing not from the obvious roads or fields, but through gaps in the hedgerows, firing smoke, maneuvering to flank. When the Germans counterattacked, the Americans vanished, only to reappear minutes later with artillery zeroed in on the exact German positions. "This isn't possible," Otto grumbled as he checked the Panthers' periscope. "They're everywhere and nowhere." Klaus nodded grimly. "They've learned the terrain faster than we have." What he didn't realize was that, just a few miles away, inside a command tent buzzing with radios and field maps, American officers were rewriting the playbook of armored warfare. Their secret weapon wasn't just steel, it was information. In the days after D-Day, the Americans had unleashed a networked system of reconnaissance unlike anything the Germans could match. Spotter planes, tiny Piper Cubs flying low over the treetops, relayed live coordinates to ground forces. Forward observers embedded with infantry units called artillery on demand. Commanders could reach every tank, every squad, and every pilot by radio within seconds. In contrast, German communication was fractured, relying on messengers, wired telephones, or radio nets limited to company or battalion level. Once the first rounds were fired, confusion spread like wildfire. By July, the Americans had turned the hedgerows from a defensive nightmare into a tactical advantage. Each Sherman platoon operated like a self-contained strike team, guided by constant updates from reconnaissance and aerial observation. When one Sherman spotted a Panther, it didn't fight alone. It called two others to maneuver for a flank shot, while infantry lobbed smoke grenades to obscure their movement. A system that had once been mocked as inferior armor and smaller guns now became an intelligent, coordinated killing machine. Late that afternoon, Klaus's unit received orders to hold a small crossroads south of St. Lo. The Panther's engines roared to life, their sound echoing through the hedgerows. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of burnt oil. "Position set," Otto called. "We'll catch them this time." Klaus peered through his binoculars. The first Sherman appeared, creeping through a break in the trees. Its turret scanned the horizon methodically. "Hunting." Klaus smirked. "Now we'll see whose gun is better." He gave the order. The Panther's cannon thundered, and the shell struck the Sherman squarely in the hull. Flames burst from its rear deck. The crew bailed out, running for cover. "Got one!" Otto cheered. But their victory lasted seconds. Two more Shermans emerged from opposite flanks, one firing smoke rounds, the other lobbing high-explosive shells to suppress. The Panther's vision was blinded instantly. Before Klaus could order a retreat, a third Sherman appeared behind a hedgerow on their left. "Impossible!" Otto shouted. "They're behind us!" A sharp crack split the air. The Sherman S-76mm round punched through the Panther S-side armor. Sparks exploded inside the turret. The loader screamed as the interior erupted in flame. Klaus and Otto threw themselves from the hatch just as the ammunition ignited, sending a tower of fire into the sky. They tumbled into the ditch, coughing and choking, the roar of the inferno behind them. Through the haze, Klaus glimpsed the Sherman trio advancing cautiously, each one covering the other. There was no gloating, no wild rush, just calm, disciplined destruction. The Germans, once the masters of the tank battlefield, were now prey. Later that evening, as darkness fell and the burning wrecks glowed like candles in the mist, Klaus and a handful of survivors stumbled through the hedgerows. Somewhere in the distance they could hear engines again, dozens of them growing louder. He stopped and turned, watching the orange light flicker over the valley. "What are we fighting now?" Otto asked quietly. Klaus shook his head. "Not tanks. A system. A machine that doesn't sleep." He was right. The Americans had turned the Sherman from a single tank into part of something far greater, a living network of men, machines, and intelligence that outthought its enemies before the first shot was even fired. For the German crews, the war had changed. They weren't fighting an opponent they could see anymore. They were fighting an idea. By the end of July 1944, the German lines in Normandy were unraveling. What began as a slow, grinding defense in the hedgerows had turned into a full retreat. Allied armor was breaking through everywhere, from St. Lo in the west to Caen in the east. The panzer divisions, battered and exhausted, had learned a bitter truth. The Sherman was no longer a joke. It was a weapon of strategy, not superiority. For Sergeant Klaus Weber, that realization came one sweltering afternoon near Coutances. His unit, what was left of it, was ordered to cover a supply road leading south. They had only 2 Panthers left and a handful of infantry. Ammunition was scarce, and fuel was running low. The forest around them was eerily quiet. No aircraft overhead, no distant artillery, just the faint hum of insects and the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. The silence made Klaus uneasy. Then faintly came the sound he now dreaded more than any other. Engines. He raised his binoculars and scanned the far end of the road. Through the heat shimmer he saw them, Shermans, 5 of them fanning out in a perfect wedge formation, each one moving with mechanical precision. Their coordination was uncanny. Klaus ducked back into cover. Positions! Wait for them to enter the kill zone. The Panthers' guns were aimed and ready, their crews tense. At 800 meters, Klaus gave the order. The first Panther fired. 1 shot, 1 kill. The lead Sherman erupted in smoke. The others immediately fanned out, vanishing behind hedgerows like ghosts. Then came the counterstrike. Mortar shells began landing within seconds, each one more accurate than the last. Within moments, the German line was under a storm of fire. "Artillery! They've zeroed in already!" Otto shouted. How could they respond so fast? Klaus didn't know, but he would soon understand. A few hundred meters away, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Rowe of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division was leaning over a radio in his Sherman, headset pressed tight to his ear. Target neutralized. Secondary Panthers still active at grid 72 by 41. Airstrike inbound. Above them, 2 P-47 Thunderbolts roared through the clouds, their engines shaking the air. Within moments, rockets streaked down and slammed into the German positions. By the time the smoke cleared, the road was silent again. For the American crews, it was another efficient engagement, planned, executed, and coordinated with surgical precision. For the Germans, it was chaos. Klaus lay half buried in the dirt, his ears ringing from the blast. His Panther lay upside down a few meters away, its treads torn off. He could hear distant voices, English, calm and methodical. They're sweeping left. "Move up and check for survivors," one voice said. Through blurred vision, Klaus watched as the Shermans advanced slowly, their turrets scanning the tree line. They weren't just searching, they were communicating, adjusting formation, relaying what they saw in real time. For the first time in the war, Klaus understood. It wasn't that the Sherman was the best tank. It wasn't. The Panther still outgunned it. The Tiger still out-armored it. But the Americans had built something the Germans could no longer match, a thinking army. Each Sherman was a single piece in a vast, synchronized organism that reacted instantly to changing conditions. Intelligence, logistics, and coordination, the unseen forces that made every Sherman twice as deadly as its specifications suggested. That was the hidden advantage, the one the Germans had never seen coming. That night, Klaus sat in the ruins of a farmhouse as the remnants of his unit regrouped. Otto stared into the fire, silent. The men were broken, not just in body, but in spirit. "They have too many tanks," one soldier muttered. Klaus shook his head. "No, they have too much information." He thought back to the first days in Normandy, how confident they'd been, how they'd laughed at the idea of a Sherman standing against a Panther. And now, watching the Americans push forward under the cover of artillery and aircraft, Klaus knew the truth. The war had entered a new age. A battle of machines had become a battle of systems, and Germany's once proud Armor Corps had no answer for it. By early August, as the Americans encircled the retreating German forces in what would soon be called the Falaise Pocket, the myth of the Sherman's inferiority was dead. The tank that once burned too easily now rolled across France like a wave, unstoppable, not because it was invincible, but because it was part of something greater than itself. Klaus Weber would survive Normandy, but he'd carry the memory of that summer forever. The sound of engines in the fog, the precision of an enemy that always seemed one step ahead, and the burning realization that the age of the lone tank ace was over. From then on, wars would not be won by the strongest armor or the biggest gun, but by the army that could see, think, and move as one. And on the hedgerows of Normandy, the Americans had proved it first.